Welcome everyone to the Blue Loop Festival of Innovations. We are talking about innovation in exhibits. And I am delighted to be talking with some of the smartest and most interesting people in the industry. And I would love for you to each introduce yourselves. Malika, do you want to start?
Sure. So, really briefly, my name is Malika Pryor, and I serve as the Chief Learning and Engagement Officer for the relatively new, still new International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina. We opened on June 27th, 2023. And I was part of the leadership team responsible for getting those doors open, which was an incredible experience. I've been in the business of museums for about 15 years now. And within my role, I essentially oversee all of what I often refer to as our mission animating team. So that's everything from exhibitions to community engagement. There are 7 teams in 6 unique departments, and they're all just doing incredibly interesting work that I know we'll talk about more as we continue.
Exciting. Amanda?
Hello, I'm Amanda Mayne. I'm Head of Partnerships of International Touring Exhibitions at the British Museum. British Museum has been touring exhibitions internationally for over 25 years, and I've been part of that team for 17 years, so I've actually been there quite a long time. I think within that time period, we've probably had around 220 exhibition openings. We've exhibited in 27 countries, 93 cities and towns, and we've reached over 28 million international visitors. We're one of 3 exhibition departments at the British Museum, alongside the London team, the Bloomsbury team, and the National Partnerships Programme. And we develop a programme of exhibitions that use the BM's collection, which we then display at partner museums around the world. And hopefully they appeal to their international audiences. I think they do. We're a department of 10 staff, so we're actually quite a large department in the landscape of touring exhibitions. And they work solely on international touring. We're lucky enough to have almost 4 curators who also work on our exhibitions. So one of the British Museum's core missions is to share the collection internationally, and it also provides that very valuable unrestricted income that the British Museum needs to support its core activities. So hello, I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you.
Wonderful. And I'm Judith Zissman. I'm the Executive Creative Director at Blue Telescope. We're a studio that does interactive and narrative media, primarily for museums, but also for themed entertainment and corporate experience centers. And we really specialize in dealing with complex topics, difficult histories, really helping to create transformative experiences for institutions to connect with their audiences. And it's just very exciting to be talking about innovation, I think is a word that gets used a lot, like immersive and some of the other buzzwords that we hear in our industry. But I think that, coming from your diverse perspectives as a new museum and one of the kind of, most venerated institutions in the world, I think we have a really nice range of perspectives to talk about kind of some of the things that we're seeing, trends, and things that arise both in your own institutions and worldwide, I think, to get the perspective of things that are coming up in 2025 and beyond. There's a lot of really exciting things on the horizon. So I wanted to start, with a kind of general question about kind of state of the world, what's happening. And Amanda, I wondered if you wanted to talk about some of the touring exhibitions that you have coming up. I know there's a lot of what we're calling unseen, kind of highlighting some things from the collection that people may not be aware of, and some really exciting things that I've had a peek on your website. I wonder if you can speak to some of those.
Absolutely. Our portfolio is quite diverse. I would say that at any time we're probably touring 8 or 9 exhibitions, but then maybe we're developing another 10 in the background. We're retiring exhibitions, and it really is a combination of all of the various things that we have in the collection at the British Museum. Things we're most known for, sort of ancient civilization exhibitions. We've just closed our biggest ever touring exhibition in Australia, actually, it was a Pharaoh, King of Egypt exhibition, which was over 500 objects, which was no mean feat. And that did extremely well for our partners there. Another Egyptian exhibition that we're planning to tour in the next year is an exhibition on Heka, ancient Egyptian magic. We're working with partners in China and Spain on an Ashurbanipal exhibition. For those who don't know, he is an ancient Assyrian king, and it's the story of his life through the collection. And then diversely, another exhibition on the art of the Pacific Islands, which is due to go to Spain early next year. There's the cross collection exhibitions. So one of my favorites at the moment is an exhibition called The Art of Imitation, which is actually a very British Museum name for fakes and forgeries and what is meant by authenticity. What do we mean by that? And that's a really exciting project coming up. One that's touring at the moment is about feminine power. So the sort of ancient practice and of feminine power through religion and all of those areas, that's doing very well at the moment. Works on paper, another big area that we work in. We're about to embark on a Rembrandt exhibition, an exhibition on French Impressionists, and then another on the masterpieces of print from 1460 to now. So the collection is very broad. But I think in the sort of more maybe the innovation area, we are currently developing an immersive exhibition, which is really exciting. And this will be about sort of ancient Egypt. It will be about the Book of the Dead. It's called The Journey to the Afterlife. We're partnering with a creative agency in Australia. We're looking to tour that exhibition from late next year. And then you mentioned the BM Unseen packages, and these are more licensing packages. So for us, a very different way of touring exhibitions. Literally, somebody would download a link. There are no objects. So this is using stories, which, let's be honest, that's what exhibitions are all about, from the museum collection. But people actually download images, they download context and text, which they then use to present the exhibition in their venues. So a real, mixture of things, and we're constantly developing new things. So that's where we are at the moment.
It's very exciting. There's a lot of things I want to ask you about as we move forward, and also a lot of themes that I heard that connect to some of your work, Malika. The power of femininity, thinking about the death and the afterlife, kind of honoring our ancestors, connecting to diverse cultures, migration between communities. I mean, we've got a lot of themes that I see in your walls. I wonder if you want to talk about what's going on at the International Museum.
Sure. Well, in our just over 18 months of operational life, an idea that was 23 years in the making, which is relatively short on a museum timeline, but to lots of folks can feel like a very long time, especially when you're investing so much energy. So as the International African American Museum, we are very much an institution that leans into the power of place. So when thinking about that notion of movement, particularly the involuntary movement of captive Africans, approximately 40% of all African captives making their way to what becomes the United States, what is the United States, passing through the port of Charleston. Our museum is actually located on a former slave wharf. At the time of its completion in the late 1770s, it was arguably the largest in all of North America in the business of the transatlantic slave trade. So we are literally, our structure, our facility is a functional homage and dedication and remembrance to those individuals who made that trek, whose literal beginnings with respect to their American journey was crossing the property that I make my way to on a nearly daily basis. So there's this grounding, both literally and figuratively, that is in operation at any time on the grounds and at the museum. And so that lower level, or that first level, our garden level, we really think of it as the beginning of the interpretive experience. Because while, yes, that's the beginning of the American journey for those individuals, it's not the beginning of their lives. It's not the beginning of their cultural being, of their cultural memory, of their understanding of family, the adoption and adaptation of something as small and as simple as a name, but as complex and as important as a name, right? And so we think about that idea of international as being one of linkages, of what people brought, of what they lost, of what they had to iterate and transform, and what they chose to transform upon arrival. And so while there's a lot of content that is Charleston and South Carolina focused in our museum, because we do lean into the power of place, and we see that as an important space to begin from. Charleston itself, in many respects, being a diasporic city, primarily settled by English Barbadian enslavers and their enslaved. So bringing a Caribbean plantation style, bringing elements and aspects of an Anglophone Caribbean reality, both settlers, but also, again, those who they were holding, which shifted the trajectory of Charleston and offered it a visual tone, architecturally, so many distinctions from the rest of the American South that we see reflected very much today. And then there is that African-American story that's sort of quintessential to museums of African-American history. And we tell this through 9 core exhibitions that are as immersive as they are interactive, as they lean into and pull on traditional material culture, artifacts, papers, letters, images, as we do contemporary and historic art that travels through all of our core exhibitions. So there is the way in which we offer a layered experience, and there are just multiple conversations between the tech and traditional artifact, between the art and the interpretive content, between didactic and and digital interactive, that often actually spurs literal conversation between visitors. And one of the benefits of being an institution in the modern age that was constructed for its purpose, rather than retrofitted, is that the design of the building also aids in facilitating the visitor's travel and movement through the space, because there are a number of difficult conversations that we undertake. But one of the beauties is that it is a modern construct. It is filled with light, often much to the chagrin of my registrar and curators. But it allows our visitor to make their way through the space and exit full without being weighted, which is a very, very delicate sort of balance, or sort of needle to, thread to needle when you've got so many topics and so many conversations that are really complex and at times quite dark. So that's the work that we do all the time. We have one special exhibitions gallery that we turned over 6 times in our opening season. And we're actually looking forward to launching our first traveling exhibition. So Amanda, we will have to chat offline. Yes.
That's also exciting. Again, there are many things that I want to ask you about, which gets into the theme, I think, of this, which is multiple conversations. I think is something that, we at Blue Telescope see a lot in our conversations with institutions about how you really are meeting people where they are, welcoming people of multiple audiences, multiple backgrounds. People bring their own stories, their own history, their own complexity. And how do you create those multiple conversations and recognize that, the experience is in that multiplicity? And I think, some of the work that we've been doing recently, we just completed a project on slavery in the American North, in the colonial North in the 1740s, a project called Kofi's Fire that we launched online as an interactive graphic novel aimed at middle and high school students to really open some conversations. Most people in the northern part of America are not aware that slavery was in the North. People think of it as something that happened on Southern plantations in Charleston, those areas, not recognizing that 1 in 5 families in the North in colonial times enslaved people in their households, in their fields, in the community. So telling underserved stories, having those multiple conversations, meeting people where they are, using new media to try and tell stories and ways that resonate with new audiences. All of those things are things I want to talk about with both of you. And, it leads me to the next question that we have, which is about kind of creating exhibits that resonate and engage with different people. I know, when you talked, Malika, about kind of the architecture, one of the things that really struck me about your museum is the idea that you have exhibits that are in conversation with each other. Yes. And with the audiences that come in, and kind of wondered if you could talk a little bit about, as you just started to, some of those kind of design for conversations and how that plays out.
Sure. So, and thank you for that question. I often use the term conversation, and I'll even sort of like forewarn if I'm touring a guest, like, you'll hear me use this term on a variety of occasions. And it's exactly that. It's conversation. And so sometimes it's very direct and very clear. In one of our galleries, South Carolina Connections, which I like to think about broadly as sort of a hall of fame, if you will, of African-American South Carolinians, or with folks with South Carolinian roots that make sort of, national and international impact. And on either side of the gallery, you have the more traditional, typical, very important material culture, again, the papers, artifacts, the bag of an actual midwife who was engaged in that practice in the early 20th century, when noting, the import of midwifery within the African-American community, particularly in rural spaces where hospitals were not available and African-Americans at a time were not allowed to enter mainstream hospitals in their communities, right? So noting that. But then in the center of that gallery, you have 16 individual interactive maps, essentially, that allow visitors to map the very same experiences, individuals and places, even beyond what it is that we're offering via didactic. And I have seen particularly young people just spend, although it's also a very intergenerational experience, but part of why I highlight young people is that so often when we think about museums, we're trying to crack the code on how to get young people to engage and to sort of care about the work that we're doing. But young people just sort of in there because they're digital natives. They know exactly how to find, they know exactly where to look. They know precisely how to utilize the technology, how to take that deeper dive, how to find those nuggets that in many instances their parents or grandparents may not even necessarily recognize are there. And so it's just really, really exciting to see them go from one space and then immediately sort of make their way to the other. And in some instances, whereas we sort of designed it with the notion that they would start with the traditional material and then make their way to the interactive, for a lot of the young people, they zoom right in on the screen. And then it sort of dawns on them like, light bulb moment. There's this content on either side that might be relevant to what it is there. So they sort of innately sort of reverse engineer what we intend. But the intent itself was there. And so we see how sometimes it works as planned. And then in other time, in other instances, visitors are sort of hacking the process and doing it in a way that speaks to them most. I mentioned art. However, one of our core exhibitions, and we refer to it as a floating core exhibition, is Creative Journeys. And Creative Journeys lives throughout the entire museum. And it is essentially a purely non-didactic means of interpreting all of our core exhibitions. And it's mostly using art, visual art. The majority of it is contemporary. So you can have juxtaposed a piece by a contemporary Ghanaian artist using Adinkra symbols as a way to reference spirituality and movement directly next to a 19th century Ashanti stool. And so what is happening between those two objects, right? And it's interesting because sometimes I'll get the question, why do y'all have so much art, right? But there are two reasons. One is that it can be disruptive in a good way. It's breaking up because we are a very content heavy museum, we're a narrative museum. We're in the business of telling stories and providing historical content. So, and that can be weighty for the brain to have so much information coming at you constantly. So it can sort of disrupt some of like literally those words. However, again, it's also creating this conversation within each of the galleries that serves as sort of this offering of a continuum that no matter which gallery you're in, you can still continue to think about the concepts that you're being introduced to, and even sometimes some Easter eggs, because you'll begin to notice how the stories themselves connect. Most of our galleries are thematically rooted. They're not married to timeline. So this also allows for us to engage and to play with theme and scope and scale with respect to geography, as well as time, which the art also facilitates and supports as folks are moving through. So it's always interesting to see how folks respond. But when thinking about the international African American experience, so much of it is communicated through art. So much of it is created through creative art. So being able to facilitate that floating exhibition throughout has been a key component for us to being able to further and even accelerate an understanding and appreciation of those historiographies.
Yeah, I mean, it's, again, I see how exciting that is within the walls of an institution. And then Amanda, you have almost the opposite challenge, which is instead of kind of welcoming people into a conversation that you've created and curated and, bounded within your walls, how do you take that conversation and send it out into the world, into a variety of experiences and contexts, and most specifically to a variety of audiences? Your audience in Australia and an audience in Dakar and an audience in Los Angeles are going to be completely different audiences. And how do you have those conversations and prepare for those?
Yeah, I would say it's probably one of my favorite things about the job. I'm going to use your word, Malika, conversations, that's what it's about. And, our exhibition portfolio, or what we choose to develop, is really informed by so many influences. It may be an exhibition that's been on in London. It may be a research project that's been done, with the staff in London, but also internationally. It may be a publication that's been produced. It really begins with conversations. And in my 17 years at the VM, I think we've developed that side of the business very well. When I started, we had 2 or 3 exhibitions that were, focusing on the main collections that everybody knew the British Museum for. But now we're developing these much more nuanced exhibitions that tell stories. And a really good example of this is our Feminine Power exhibition, which is currently in Spain. But has been all over the world. It was on in London, then it went to Australia. It's now in Spain. It's going to, I think, the Netherlands at some point in a couple of years. But this really is, it's conversations between those objects, and it's a real mixture of traditional artifacts, contemporary artworks, contemporary voices. We actually have a section, which sort of a talking head section, which we change everywhere it goes in the world. So in London, we had, prominent women thinkers and speakers who, it was at the beginning of the exhibition. So the public were introduced to these schools of thought or these various themes by people they would recognize. That changed for Australia. That will change again. It's changed for Spain. And I think what is really important is that the exhibitions we tour are not turnkey exhibitions. We don't, send the objects, the design in a shipping container, and that's what you put on. That isn't what we do. It makes things more complicated and it takes longer. And you could probably say it adds to the cost as well. But I think it makes it relevant. So we have to engage in those conversations. And we're very keen that our partner institutions have an exhibition that will speak to their audience. It's not just about it being a British Museum exhibition. It's a partnership, a collaboration. I think of our Mesopotamia exhibition that's currently in China. There was a lot of work done with our Chinese partner to make that relevant to the Chinese audience. There was a timeline. So, you could see where perhaps King Ashurbanipal, what he was doing at a certain period, and then what was happening in China at the same time, what was happening in Europe, what was happening in North America. It's about connecting people to that and ways of doing it. And I think that's the innovation of touring exhibitions, is finding that voice that will resonate with an audience. We actually also encourage our partners to add their own objects or their own stories into our exhibitions. And that's not just, just paying lip service. It's really important that when visitors go to their local museum or, a national institution in their country, they can see those connections around the world. So we try our best. It's not always easy, but it's something that we're really keen on doing. Most of our partners actually employ a project curator that works actively with our curator from the very beginning. So they will have those conversations and weave those themes through what they want to tell their audiences. So that's how it works at the moment. Yeah.
Wonderful. That's cool. Well, I know, part of why we're here is really to talk about innovations and trends and kind of the future. And I think that, we all have seen some really exciting things, both as part of judging the awards, the innovation awards, but also just in our lives as curious, interesting people going out in the world and seeing things. I know it's been a wonderful time, I think, post-COVID, as people return to in-person experiences and seeing what gets people out of the house, what gets people into the institutions, and what do we see in the world of exhibits. And so I wanted to see, Amanda, if there's some things you've noticed in terms of overall trends, and then specifically exciting exhibits that you want to call attention to.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think for us, the British Museum is a very old museum. 1753, we've been, exhibiting things and inviting people to come in and see those things which belong to them as much as, they do the museum. For us, it's been quite a challenge to turn that focus away from the object, because that is our bread and butter, if you like. That's what we do. We present objects, we tell stories. So I think you're right. Since COVID, which I think accelerated innovation that perhaps would have happened anyway, but at a much quicker pace, we're beginning to think about how we can tell these stories or enhance these stories, equally with objects, with digital, with immersive experiences, but also without the objects. In the current climate, budgets are very difficult. Things are very expensive across the world. There's a lot of, turmoil going on. We want to get out to as many people as we can so that they can see these exhibitions and understand, question, and have those conversations. So for us, it's this sort of dual development, I suppose. You have the more traditional exhibitions, which do have the digital content in, but then something like our immersive experience we're developing, Journey to the Afterlife. This is going to give people a sort of whole new take on perhaps what they think they know about the Egyptian underworld, or the Egyptian beliefs, if you like, of the Book of the Dead and how that will affect your journey into the next life. People can actively take part in that, which I think is very exciting for us. I mentioned the BM Unseen projects before, but equally, this project is going to enable people that ordinarily perhaps wouldn't consider a British Museum exhibition. There are costs involved with moving these exhibitions around the world, and I would say many of those costs we have no control over. We're at, we have to rely on other people to offer services of shipping things around the world, insurance, all of those more, less sexy, shall we say, aspects of touring an exhibition. So, to be able to send somebody a link they can download that they can then present, that we can then have a dialogue with them. We can send staff if that's possible, or things like that. It's really, really important. And I think for me, the changes I've seen in the landscape in the last 3 or 4 years is that people are beginning to think that that's a possibility, that actually the parameters of an exhibition do not stop in a gallery walls, do not sit within a display case, do not sit with the text on a label. And as you said, the next generation coming through, the challenge is to get those people, as Malika said, getting people in there and making it relevant to them. So, it's exciting for us. And what we've done recently is we have launched a survey where, it's a pretty traditional way of doing things, but it's, how you get answers to questions and understand people's planning for the future. We're asking people, what are you looking for? What stories do you want to tell? And I'm very lucky to, travel to conferences and, go to different places in the world. And I'm actively asking people, tell us what you want. Because we're not in the business of just presenting something to someone. These exhibitions need to be alive. So, sorry, a bit of a long answer, but
no, I'm curious what the responses you're getting are when you ask people what they want. What are you hearing?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So, I think before COVID, maybe when there was more budgets for people, that kind of thing. And it's a bit of a paradox, really, because you would actually think that people were saying, oh, we need less objects, we need smaller exhibitions. But they're not. They're actually saying we want blockbusters, we want big things, we want to be able to, shout from the rooftops. These are the stories we're trying to tell. On the practical level, they need to attract sponsorship as well. So, you think of the Pharaoh exhibition we've just displayed in Melbourne. Just the planning of that exhibition and the logistics and all of that, you would think would have made it impossible, but it created such a buzz in Melbourne and the surrounding areas. I was lucky enough to go to the opening, and the exhibition was beautifully done. It was, huge exhibition across the whole floor of the National Gallery of Victoria. But when I left the museum and I would go into sort of downtown Melbourne, there were people having conversations at tables about what they'd seen or what they were hoping to see, or they didn't think they would, learn something new. And yeah, I must admit, on a couple of occasions, I did say to people, oh, I'm actually from the British Museum. I'm really happy that you'll be talking about this. And it was just a great conversation starter, yeah. So
it's exciting. I imagine you have a similar experience, Malika, hearing people talk about your institution, and,
yes.
and I wonder if you want to talk about that and then move into talking a little about trends in future as well.
Sure. So I was just going to say that's highly relatable, Amanda, especially sort of in those first 6 to 12 months, although we're not that far removed from them. I would sort of walk into the coffee shop and I'd see someone with with an International African American Museum bag, or, something indicating that they'd already been. Sometimes folks would still be wearing their pin, or, sort of the wristbands indicating that they'd visited. And you could, sometimes you could hear folks sort of talking about what their experience had been. For us as a museum that is dedicated to telling this holistic and in many respects global story, while somehow striving to counterbalance that with being very much rooted in Charleston, albeit not being a local museum, it's as important to us that we can sort of hear from those visitors who are often coming from other places. Charleston is very much a sort of a magnet for travel and tourism. But also prior to opening, getting to hear from Charlestonians, particularly African-American Charlestonians, that we'd gotten the story right. So the feedback, and Amanda, you really sort of spoke to just this idea that I think is perhaps one of the most important innovations for museums, and maybe not just post-COVID, but to your point, I think was accelerated by the kinds of other conversations that began to happen that were not necessarily museum related, but in some instances were very much about museums, even the question of whether or not as a sector we should be. but it is this idea that we're not just the light atop the hill, that yes, we are presenting, we are sharing information, but that we also want to be presenting the kind of content and doing the sorts of things that are really going to be relatable and speak to the people that we're hoping to bring into the spaces. I think that's probably one of the most important innovations for our sector in the modern era, is that we've come to the realization that we are not inevitable, or perhaps are not inevitable, that we are not just a gift onto our community or onto the world, but that we really are in conversation with our community. And that, while yes, it's our responsibility to be subject matter experts, we are also learning as institutions. We are not all knowing. And not only do I think that's one of the greatest and most important, I think it's also one of the more useful for us, because in allowing ourselves to in part be led or at least informed by our larger community, which, I mean, to your point, Amanda, I mean, engaged in international, touring museums, that's like the planet. Your community is the planet. For us, it's a little bit narrower in scope, but in some ways just as diverse. It's funny how you can be engaged in a very specific conversation and still manage to find a million different ways to tell it. So it also helps us to know what people want to be doing when they make their way. So whether that's a question of immersion or folks being able to come into the space, which I also think is interesting, as much as we've leaned as museums into digital, there's also, I think, a call for people or from folks to actually want to be in person and to want to be engaging with the physicality. So it's not surprising to me at all to hear folks say, we want to see the blockbuster, because I think people really do want to be able to come and to show up and to feel and to experience. And I think as human beings, as much as we are dependent upon technology, I think we're still fundamentally what we've always been, and that is a pack species. And we need more than just the virtual. We need the actual reality that's tangible. And that's certainly been one of our experiences, even though one of the things that I really love to see museums getting into more is what it looks like to be able to take content that we are producing or where we have expertise, and then offering sort of points of engagement out in communities. And that sometimes can take the form of something much, much grander, like an exhibition, but like public artworks that provide opportunities for interaction and additional data that, can sort of create breadcrumbs, if you will, towards the institution, or, just be sort of a standalone that's also increasing and elevating that community visibly is some of the stuff that I love to see museums doing and supporting.
Yeah, and your museum, I think, does it really well with kind of the indoor-outdoor space and the area that is, kind of publicly available to people walking past to really engage with kind of the themes and content at the garden level. I think, two of the themes that have come up for us as we, are thinking about the current moment and the future are, I like to talk about being embodied and embedded, and what it means to physically have your body in a space at a time when things are increasingly digital and virtual. What are the affordances of being physically in a space? And what does it mean to engage with your body? And, for example, on your garden level, Malika, to see the outlines of bodies, to see the shapes of where people were with your own body in a place where other bodies have been and are, and what that means to be there. And then, to talk about being embedded in community and, the kind of things that you just raised about, moving away from the kind of elite museum as expert, that we are coming in a didactic way to tell you about your lived experience, how we move away from that as institutions. And, those are the exciting things that I see when we talk about trends and innovation, are how the whole shift in storytelling and multiple perspectives and kind of moving into those realms. And I think, we saw in some of the entries for the awards, different ways in which the visitor can be inserted directly into the story, whether that's with artificial intelligence or other kinds of affordances where, especially, you know, as you talked about, Malika, some of the younger generation where they're digital natives, how do we use their visual language, their physical gestures, the way that they move seamlessly between digital and physical to really bring them into the moment and help them ask, where's my place in this story? And, you know, that then is like, the next official question we have here is, what do we see as the future? You know, where do we see things going? And I think I would broaden that question to say, what's the future we want to see? Because sometimes the future that we are seeing isn't necessarily the future we want to see. So I want to ask you both about hopes and dreams, as well as what you see on the horizon. Amanda, do you want to start?
I think for me, we will never lose that magical feeling, that interaction with an object that speaks to you. You know, I've been working in museums for 25 years now, and I still get that moment with the hair standing up on the back of my neck where I understand an object, I have a connection with an object, and I'm super excited by it. You know, touring exhibitions we've done, I've been lucky enough to go to, you know, 10s and 20s of exhibition openings, and that moment where you see something and you understand it, you can't replace that necessarily. I don't always think it has to be an object. I think the digital enhances. I think there's different experiences. You can immerse yourself, but I still think that magical interaction with an object that you know is, you know, 1,000 years old, or you know the story behind it, I don't think we'll ever go, because I do think we are physical, you know, beings. There is that. So I hope for me, for the future, for the dreams of, you know, all of what we do, is that, you know, we're still going to be able to tour these amazing things, that it's not going to become too difficult, that there are not going to be you know, barriers put in place about sharing these things internationally. I would hope that we partner with many diverse museums around the world. As you said, it doesn't have to be an exhibition. It can be something smaller, you know, more boutique that you can work with. But that's why I'm still at the British Museum 17 years later, because I am still thoroughly enjoying what I do. So I want the visitor to also have that. And I think for the British Museum, it's not unique, but it's a slightly different scenario maybe from yours, Malika, because so many of our visitors are international tourists. You know, people have a bucket list when they come to London, and the British Museum is very often on that. So it's
it was on mine.
Yeah. If you come again, please let me know. If you know, there's that balance, if you like. You've got to find that moment where you have international visitors coming because they want to see the world-renowned British Museum, but then you have that local audience, which is equally, if not more important, to speak to. So I hope we just keep working on that, and we're about to undergo a huge refurbishment of the museum, which is going to take many decades. So let's hope that gives us opportunities to also share more in the future.
Absolutely. Malika, can you talk a little bit about the future you see and your hopes and dreams?
So the future I see is one that's filled with, I think, a lot of opportunity. Museums, large and small, are often slow moving when it comes to change. And for me, I think every challenge is an opportunity. So what that presents is lots of opportunities for us to consider what it looks like to sort of take our time, but also maybe occasionally hurry up. And I do think that we've begun to challenge ourselves around what it looks like to increase our own bandwidth, as opposed to sometimes having to be moved into directions that maybe are more complex or are more nuanced, are more difficult. And we often use that, that phrase, difficult conversations. And I do think that as museums, we're continuing to do that. I want a future that's more grounded in equity when thinking about how institutions are funded, and how the metric for what it looks like to think about what institutions can do what. I think in many respects, IAM is a little bit of a disruptor, because generally First Voice museums are physically smaller museums, but they have historically been thought about as museums with less capacity. But it's never really been a failure of sort of intellectual or creative capacity. As a matter of fact, it's need is often generates incredible brilliance and creativity. But it's often a question of fiscal capacity. And so what I hope funders, whether they be individuals or communities or grantors, that they continue to think about and to prioritize cultural institutions, and to begin to rethink what it looks like to think of this vast range of institutions as fully funded. There's incredible work that I've seen historic houses do when just given the opportunity to build out some of that capacity to do the wonderful thing that they've had in mind. So that's the future that I'm hoping for, that we just kind of open up ourselves to the reality that the possibilities are endless at every single sort of level of museum, and that we're just encouraged to be as brave as sometimes I think we are, but we aren't quite yet. And so that's in a nutshell the future that I'm hoping for, one where we really are as brave as we want to be.
That's fantastic. Not to put you on the spot, but I'm curious if there are exhibits specifically that you are thinking of that are as brave as you hope for, or as at maybe as challenging or provocative, or what's kind of if we think about the landscape, is there something that you can point people to that you think is either an institution or an exhibit or an object that really is doing some of that brave work?
Well, I'm always excited to see whatever Studio Museum of Harlem is doing. But I'm going to so I'm originally from Detroit, so in Charleston I would be considered a Kamya, meaning that I'm not originally from Charleston. And so I'm going to shout out the Detroit Institute of Arts, which is the art museum in the city of Detroit. And it's a nationally and even internationally renowned art museum, and it's quite massive in terms of its size, and in terms of aged museums in the United States is pretty old. Sort of second half of the 19th century. Long story short, one of the things that I've seen them begin to do more is to really invest in exhibitions that have Detroit arts roots. And so they currently have a contemporary exhibition that features the work of a Detroit-based artist, Tiff Massey, which is really exploring all things contemporary Detroit, but particularly sort of an African-American urban Detroit aesthetic, in this incredibly beautiful and elevated and nuanced way. And so that capacity, that bandwidth that you see from a DIA, which is certainly much more, it's much more robustly funded than your everyday museum as a major museum, taking the time and really vesting and partnering with a very forward-thinking, very cutting-edge artist, and then again, sort of elevating that work and bringing it to scale is one of those opportunities that I think, and that I hope other museums, wherever they might be placed, are sort of taking advantage. We had the opportunity to do that similarly with a Charleston-based artist, Fletcher Williams, in an exhibition earlier, technically last year, where we explored this idea of the conversation that sort of lives at the edge of the rural and urban for young folks that grow up in the urban South. And it was just this really beautiful conversation that was as Southern as it was Low Country specific, as it was kind of universally American in some respects, as it was specifically African American and Charlestonian. So those kinds of opportunities are ones that I think are really, really interesting. And an exhibition is beautifully done.
Wonderful. And Amanda, same question. If there's an exhibit or a moment that you had, you talk about the hair on the back of your neck standing up with an object. Is there something that's
so
really
many? Am I allowed to say the British Museum? I mean, I'm not sure I am, but I think people should come to the British Museum and see what's going on. There are some very different things there. There's a very interesting exhibition at the moment by the artist Hugh Locke, which is, a response to the collection, those difficult conversations, which I think sometimes people imagine that the British Museum and other nationals don't have, but we do. They just don't get the press that they need to get. If I were to think of an international, one exhibition is really hard, but
It is.
I always get a thrill when I go to, somewhere where perhaps you wouldn't expect there to be an amazing exhibition. I was fortunate enough to go to Colombia last year, and I'm co-chair of ICOM exhibitions. So we had our conference in Colombia, and we had our conference, that was the year before last. Last year was Estonia. So our aim is to partner with, areas around the world where we need to tell these stories. And I loved, Malika, your use of the word disruptor, because my co-chair, Hilary Spencer, who is American and who's in Washington, D.C., that is her middle name. I mean, she runs workshops on taking risks and, trying to push people forward to make them to have these conversations. So Colombia was very impressive for me because, again, from a fiscal perspective, they're not well funded, but that passion of getting those stories out was so important. And equally in Estonia, probably not many people would visit Estonia. I urge them to. The National Museum of Estonia was so impressive, the work they're doing and the quality. So I could go on for ages. I won't give you all of those examples, and I apologize for using the British Museum as one of mine, but I do think it's important that people come back.
No, absolutely. I mean, I love to see people have pride in their own work and institutions as well. I'll combine and talk a little bit about some work we're doing in Michigan as well. I think the Detroit art scene, as you mentioned, Malika, is phenomenal. We've done a bunch of work recently in Flint, which is just such an exciting community with a really growing art scene and a lot of creative talent. And, institutions that are committed to, again, having difficult conversations about the economic and environmental challenges, challenges of racism in the community. We're working on an augmented reality piece now with the Sloan Museum about fair housing, looking at the history of redlining. Flint was, one of the first communities in the U.S. to push back on the redlining and the, divisive and racist housing practices in this country. And Flint stood up and ended some of those practices and, has had a difficult legacy and part of what we're using some interesting technology to tell those stories in new ways. And I think that's, again, when we talk about trends, some of, what's most interesting to me is how do we use these new tools, use these new techniques, visual approaches, storytelling approaches. One of the things that I mentioned, our Kofi's Fire project earlier, which was really visually influenced by, the Spider-Verse aesthetic and kind of superhero stories. And how do we bring those things that, really do connect to new audiences and use those to tell stories in new ways, if we're going to tell the story of the 1741 uprising and Northern slavery, how do we make it relevant to today's audiences? And the answer might be superheroes, right? And, you know, that sort of leads me, we have a question about challenges and kind of what do we see as the biggest challenges? Where do we want to bring attention for the people watching this? What do we need to kind of raise awareness of? What are the challenges that we face, and how do we see our community fighting those challenges? Malika, do you want to?
So again, I think of every challenge as an opportunity. So in many respects, my answer to possibilities is the same as challenge, and it is, and Amanda, you've mentioned it on a few occasions. It is one of fiscal capacity, but I think also logistics, being able to move, whether physically or digitally, because there is a cost and infrastructure that's necessary, sometimes physical, for for digital work, and being able to ensure that it's accessible in a rural community as much as it is in an urban center, right? So I think one of our challenges as museums is what it looks like, not just to get people to where we are, but also to be able to really communicate effectively wherever the people are. When I served as deputy and head of communications education for the National Art Gallery of the Bahamas, it was both a challenge of communication, of helping the local and national Bahamian audience understand that we represented them because we held the national art collection, and that they really were our first audience, in spite of the fact that it's a national museum centered in Nassau, which is this, again, a magnet for tourism, not so dissimilarly from Charleston, that there was often an expectation that the museums were precisely designed for the Americans, Canadians, British, others who were making their way, and not designed. So I think there's a challenge of communication in some instances for museums that, as Amanda has spoken to, and I've mentioned, that we really are, either we were constructed explicitly. We had the good fortune, coming into being in 2023 to be constructed explicitly for that access. For museums that are older, what it looks like to reconstruct and reimagine ourselves so that we can be seen and understood as accessible. So I think there's that communication challenge of accessibility, and then that very real challenge of accessibility, that as we continue to contemplate how we get these messages and how we create these experiences and opportunities, that we're able to get them out to the people, which when we were striving to travel the national collection in an archipelago, where systems were designed mostly for extraction. So what it looks like to take resources and people out of the country, what did it mean for us to be able to build a network where folks could actually see the collection that belonged to them? So on a much smaller scale, Amanda's sending things from the Netherlands to Melbourne, but there's still that question of how we're able to get it done. And sometimes it's easier to do it from further distances because you do have the infrastructure than it sometimes is to send it to your neighbor where the infrastructure doesn't exist. So I think that those are the challenges, that communication, but then also that infrastructure. And I suppose in some ways those are both infrastructure challenges.
Yeah. Same question for you, Amanda.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with what Malika has said. You can break this down into that fiscal or those logistical challenges, which have always been there, have got more challenging in the last couple of years, but they've always been there. I suppose for me, one of the biggest challenges that I'm sort of seeing is the geopolitical challenges, the rise of voices that, potentially we never thought we'd hear again, those challenges where people are not open to dialogue and discussion, which they need to be. We need to have these discussions and for people to think critically about museums and what they can bring to the wider public. How do they make people feel? Why would that it make you think of how your place is in connection with other communities, the past, what can we learn? I think for me, the challenge is about keeping those channels of communication open. And I think, we're in we're in quite dark times with some of that at the moment, and I think it's really important that, you know, those conversations are still had and that people feel safe to have those conversations. So I suppose for me, it's my hope is that, you know, that challenge does become an opportunity, Malika, and we keep pushing forward. But I'm sure that, you know, there's a lot of people that work in institutions around the world, and, you know, in industries that are connected to that will keep this open. But it's just about being open-minded.
No, indeed.
Absolutely. Well, speaking of keeping conversations going, I wish we could just keep talking for the next hours, days, weeks. I've really loved speaking with you both. I sort of want to start a podcast now with maybe the three of us just talking museums.
Yes.
So, but thank you both for your time and your expertise and you know, really provocative, fascinating insight into this work that we all do and love. And I want to thank the people who are watching as well, and thank the folks at blooloop for giving us this opportunity to talk about innovation and exhibits and all of these things that we see. Coming up next will be the winners of the exhibit category awards, which is very exciting. I know there was a terrific group of exhibits submitted for these innovation awards. So very excited to see the winners. So thank you both for your time. And this was really an absolute delight. Take care.
Thank you. It's a pleasure.
Indeed.
And now the winners of the 2024 blooloop Innovation Awards exhibit category. Third place, The People's House, a White House Experience from Ralph Applebaum Associates. Second place, Musée Atelier Audemars Piguet from Atelier Bruckner. First place, Museum of the Future, Journey of the Pioneers from Atelier Bruckner. Congratulations to all of the winners.